Good evening, everyone. I'm Loretta Ross, Treaty Commissioner at the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. I want to welcome you to our second session in our online event entitled Agowiidiwinan, Treaties, Moving Forward Together. Before we begin, I will go over a few housekeeping rules. The meeting is being recorded and it will be posted to the TRCM YouTube channel, hopefully within 48 hours. All participants have been muted until our live question and answer period at the end of tonight's presentation. We hope you came with questions and we encourage you to share when we open up the floor for Q&A after today's presentation. Feel free to post your questions in the feed loop chat bar to the right of the screen or save them until the end when we open up the floor to Zoom question and answer. As we did in our first session, we will open this session with a song by our respected elder, Sherry Kopanes.
So the song that I'll render for you is a song that I referenced that belonged to my late great uncle, the late Clifford Skeet, and this is the song he always rendered prior to going into any one of the lodges. So I'll use my shaker. He always used a hand, but I'll use my shaker to do that. Inga bindega kiwegiwa Yahweh 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 So that was his song.
So thank you to Elder Kopanes for sharing her beautiful gift of song and for starting us off in a beautiful way. So we want to remind you, as this four-part webinar series is an opportunity for us to reflect on the treaties and the treaty relationship and renewal. So we thank you for joining us on this journey as we are going to examine 150 years of treaty making and then take an in-depth look at how settlers, newcomers, and First Nations people can live together today and in the future in a good way. After all, we are all treaty people and treaties are to benefit all of us. We have gathered some incredible speakers, and if you were with us last week, you heard from our amazing elders, Elder Florence Painter and Elder Harry Bone, who shared an elder's perspective on the spirit and intent of treaties. We will also bring you some university scholars who will help us to understand how Indigenous law and UNDRIP relate to treaties and how we can envision new ways in which we can move forward together. So welcome once again to this stimulating and thought-provoking series. Today, we will start with a discussion on the importance of kinship and the political power of family as it relates to treaty and the treaty relationship, and why it is important that we understand this if we are to move forward together. So with us today, we have Erin Mills, Assistant Professor and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Constitutionalism and Philosophy at McGill University. Erin works to understand how Indigenous systems of law function and how they might assist in identifying and in changing violent dynamics of Indigenous settler relationships and of human-earth relationships on Turtle Island today. His core political project is Indigenous Constitutional Revitalization, which places Earth at the center of law. Erin works with Indigenous elders, communities, advocacy and service organizations, and governments to support their goals in this area. He also frequently supports Canadian governmental bodies, civil society groups, and educational institutions wanting to educate themselves about Indigenous law and/or colonialism. He has sat on the board of directors of the Indigenous Bar Association and of Aboriginal Legal Services, and has served as editor-in-chief of the Indigenous Law Journal, during which tenure he created the Community Voices feature. His work on Indigenous constitutionalism has garnered numerous awards. As a graduate student, Erin was a SSHRC Talent Award winner, a Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation Scholar, a Vanier Canada Scholar, and a Fulbright Canada Scholar. Erin was the lead investigator of a project he and his grandmother recently completed in their own community, taking a first step to revitalize the Anishinaabe legends telling tradition at Agowiidiwinan First Nation. Professor Mills joined the faculty in 2018. On August 1st, 2019, he took up the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Constitutionalism and Philosophy. So welcome, Erin. We are so honored to have you here with us, and we are looking forward to hear your presentation. We will entertain, as I had mentioned, audience questions throughout through the online chat option at the end of Erin's presentation. But for now, we want to jump right in, and I want to turn it over to Erin to share his thoughts on kinship and political power of family. So welcome, Erin.
Oh, Miigwech, Commissioner, I'm delighted to be here. And I also want to recognize Grandmother Kopanes for her beautiful gift of song, bringing us in to this space tonight in a good way together. Abuju, and Dinwe Mognituk. Hello, my dear relatives. I'm so delighted to be speaking with you this evening. Our treaties are so important. Our traditional systems of law are so important. And tonight, I get to bring them together. I was asked to share an Anishinaabe law perspective of treaties, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity. If you hear something tonight that touches your heart or sparks a new idea, or maybe which doesn't sit well with you, I hope you share afterwards so that I and the rest of us gathered here this evening can learn from you. Anishinabe in Dao, Guchiching in Dunjaba, Makwa in Totem. I am an Anishinaabe. I'm from Guchiching First Nation in Treaty 3, and I belong to the Bear Clan. I was raised by my mother, Patricia Mills, in North Bay, Ontario. And through my father, I'm part of the Sinclair family at Guchiching First Nation. And in an event which changed my life, I was adopted into the Mainville family as well. Bessie Mainville was my teacher, and she adopted me as her grandson, though she never called me her adopted grandson, just grandson. My other teacher, to help you situate where my knowledge is coming from this evening, was an elder from Mitanjigaming who taught that after someone makes their journey to the spirit world, we don't use their name anymore, but I acknowledge him as well. Today, I have Elder Harry Bone as my trusted guide and very dear friend, and I have Grandmother Sherry Kopanes in that role as well. And they help me to live out the Anishinaabe law principles, some of which I'll be speaking about this evening. Having said all of that, I'd like to share that what I offer tonight is just my own understanding. and there are many other understandings of Anishinaabe law and of treaty, and that they are true too. Finally, I'm a husband and I'm a father of 2 boys, aged 4 years and 9 months. Now I realize that such an extended introduction has taken some time, and we have precious little of that. But if I do a good enough job during this lecture, my hope is that by the end, you'll understand why it was worth the time it took to do it right at the outset. My lecture tonight consists of 4 parts. As I go, each one gets smaller. I'm going to start with Anishinaabe law and work my way towards treaty. In the first 2 parts, I begin to sketch out a picture of Anishinaabe law in Anishinaabe, the Anishinaabe language, Anishinabe. It takes 2 parts because when I started asking elders 15 years ago if they would teach me about Anishinaabe law, I received 2 kinds of answers. Some elders tend to focus on what we call teachings. Other elders answered the question by focusing much more on knowing who one is, a question of identity. So in the first part, we'll try to understand what teachings are and how they allow for Anishinabe, again, one Anishinaabe word for law. In the second part, we'll explore the concept of kinship, as this lecture is titled, and how this relational kind of identity provides boundaries for our use of teachings in the service of Anishinabe. In the third part, I want to explain why we have a kinship system at all. And to do so, I link up with what Elder Bone and Elder Painter taught us last time about sacred and natural law. I'll briefly explain how kinship flows from these sources. And in the last part, I'm going to try to show the picture of treaty that comes into view with these first 3 parts in place. So to begin, teachings. My grandmother was an elder who ordinarily answered the question, Noko, can you teach me about Anishinaabe law? By turning to teachings. Sometimes she would take me out on the land, either to do things like showing me how to make a proper offering, or just to be with the land while we spoke about it. For really weighty matters, she would often take me to a place that at Couchiching we call the 7 Oaks. Other times, she answered my question by talking about her dreams, and more generally, by sharing about the importance of dreams. So I would ask her for help in understanding our system of law. She would start talking about dreams. Sometimes she answered my question by doing ceremony or by teaching me about ceremony. Now, since I was a university student, it was usually summer when I would come visiting her, and she would begin and close each visit with a pipe ceremony. And she would talk about naming ceremonies, since that was one of the gifts that she carried. Once I was her helper in a naming ceremony. And I'm not sure that there was any topic that mattered more to her than young woman's berry fast, a coming of age ceremony for women. Sometimes she answered my question with her own thoughts about Anishinaabe ways of being, like Agowiidiwinan, the path of kindness, or with practices like the importance of gifting, of feasting, of taking care of others, all things we often did together. She also taught me about legal processes like the circle, how it works and why, and how she conducts one. And one winter I served as her helper while she conducted weekly circles at Couchiching over 4 months. Sometimes she answered my question by taking me to visit other elders. I would listen to them chat and laugh and watch them connect. Often, much of it was in Anishinabe, and I couldn't always follow, but I learned a lot from witnessing her relationships. Still other times, she answered my question with stories, and there were different kinds. One, the Bajamoanan, were stories she remembered or others who had told them to her. And she would tell me stories about learning from her teachers, her two aunts at Manitou Rapids, or about witnessing ceremonies or community meetings, adventures she had, community history, how things used to be and why. Another kind of story, Adsokanan, are about our ancestors and sacred beings, and we usually only tell them in winter so as to avoid having those being discussed overhearing our tellings of them. She loved the Adsokan of Nanabojo turning into a bunny, and she would often talk about his feet. And she loved best of all the stories about Majikikwewisuk, the foolish sisters. So I brought tobacco, Nigani Asema, and sometimes a gift to my grandmother to teach me Anishinaabe law. And she answered by speaking about the land, dreams, ceremony, her own thoughts, her relationships, and different kinds of stories. Now you should know, none of this matched my expectations. I came to her after having grown up away from my reserve, after having just completed my first year of law school with ideas of Canadian law filling my head. I expected her to tell me about our rules and our rule making, rule interpreting, and rule enforcing institutions. I expected that learning Anishinaabe law would mean learning about our Anishinaabe versions of legislatures, of courts, of police, etc. It took me 2 whole years to realize that that kind of information was never coming. My expectations were misplaced. I'd been imposing an entirely different concept of law onto our conversations. What we have as Anishinaabe isn't our version of the kind of law that Canadians have. Our own system of laws is distinct all the way down to its foundations. There's no cultural training program that can give you that depth of understanding. It requires a different life world, not a different perspective. And ideally, it begins when we're babies, watching the way the rest of the world relates to itself. We used to develop this capacity with Tikanagan, the cradle board. So Tikanagan, cradle boards for babies, are actually part of our legal system. But the journey can be undertaken at any time. So Nokomis, my grandmother, wasn't focused on teaching me rules or rule-centered institutions. If you get a teaching from an elder, from the earth, from the spirits in ceremony or dreams, or from a story, it doesn't tell you what to do. It doesn't take the form of a rule. Teachings just aren't like that. Now, rules aren't self-enforcing either. People disagree about what rules really mean all the time. Rules always have to be interpreted. But teachings don't seem to be even trying to point one towards some particular result. Rather, the whole point is that you, as the recipient, have to bring your heart, your mind, your spirit, and your body to bear upon a teaching, both to make meaning of it and to use it appropriately. So here we come to the central point. Unlike rules, which live partly outside of us, which can be written down in codes or cases, teachings live only inside. They require you for life. This is why you might sometimes hear an elder say, Anishinaabe law is written on the heart, or that you have to connect heart, spirit, body, and mind if you want to understand. This is also why elders sometimes refuse to have their teachings written down, not because of a fundamentalist stance against writing, but rather because as soon as you commit it to writing, you risk capturing it, making it timeless and spaceless, draining it of life. Now that doesn't have to happen. And more elders are starting to allow themselves to be recorded. But it happens if we receive a recorded teaching as a rule, as opposed to information that we have to take in and make life of ourselves. So how do we do this? And how do we do it well, not badly? Imagine a moment of decision-making. Doesn't matter what kind, Maybe you're being asked to teach someone, maybe to stop someone who's being violent, maybe to harvest wild sage, or just to pick the kids up after school. You don't look for the appropriate rule to interpret. Your job is to synthesize your teachings into an appropriate course of action. You reflect on, hopefully, the vast array of teachings that you carry from elders, earth, stories, your own life experience, etc., to help you come up with the answer that will direct your course of action. And to be rigorous and effective in doing this, you'll need to access many teachings from different kinds of sources. You don't just pick your favorite story or your favorite aunt, and then you have to bring them into relationship with one another to find your truth. It can be hard. Sometimes it takes seconds, sometimes weeks. And this is Anishinabe, bringing it together to come to a settled answer. And since it comes from you, it is every time an exercise of judgment. We do it best when we reason through mind, heart, spirit, and body. Privileging any of these over the others will tend to produce imbalance. We're strongest when we have all four parts of our reasoning selves aligned in a good relationship with each other. That's a foundation for strong, grounded judgment. And this activity, Anishinabe, is why when I asked my grandmother to teach me about our Anishinaabe system of law, she started talking about ceremonies or stories, or took me out on the land. She wasn't giving me our definition of law. She was filling me up so I could actually do it. So Anishinaabe law could live within me, and I could act appropriately. It was the most remarkable gift. And now I'm sharing it in this way tonight with you, so that hopefully you won't be as foolish as I was. Teachings aren't just culture. Teachings are law. And I'm trying to unpack that concept slowly so that you can start to see it that way. Now, that just about brings me to the close of this first part. But before moving on to part two, I want to acknowledge some of you might be worried. You might have identified a problem about the reliability and predictability of this kind of law. If Anishinaabe law comes from within, if it generates from internalized teachings and ultimately relies upon an internal judgment as to what is appropriate, then how is it law at all? Doesn't this make each of us a law unto ourselves? Can't I just interpret my teachings to my own advantage? In a system like this one, what's to stop me? Well, there are many parts to the answer, and I can't canvass them all in this lecture tonight. One important point is that Anishinabe isn't always private. Often we'll consult others in our decision-making processes. And we have collective processes oriented towards Anishinabe as well. One is Agowiidiwinan, the council, in which we deliberate together to produce decisions. But even those decisions which are made by individuals acting independently have boundaries. It's never the case that my job is to apply teachings in a vacuum. That's never expected of me. We live in a deeply related world. Everything is connected. And it's through this context of thick relationality that my decisions come into this world. So, part two, how kinship provides boundaries for how we interpret our teachings in the service of Anishinabe, bringing it together. Recall that many elders answered my question, can you teach me about Anishinaabe law in a different way? Instead of imparting teachings to me, they offered some version of learn who you are. And there are indeed many versions of that direction. It might be come into the lodge. It might be go out and fast on the land. Richard Wagamese shared a remarkable story about a fast he did and what he learned about himself from it in For Joshua, and I recommend it to you. It might be learn your name and clan. In different moments, these are all directions that were shared with me, and I followed all of them. But to what end did I do so? If this is a journey, did I get wiser for it? I'm sad to say, no, I don't think so. I'm the same guy. But while I haven't developed deep self-knowledge, I have learned one thing, and it has been life-changing. And it's that, in a strange way, my identity actually isn't about me. I learned that who I am is actually a question about everyone else. It's about my family, my community, my clan, traditional territory, treaty, and this one shared earth. It's about my place in each of these relationships. Look at how we introduce ourselves, in particular to other Indigenous peoples. We don't say, hi, I'm a professor or an iron worker or a policy analyst. Instead, we say things like, this is the family I come from, relationship. This is my community, relationship, my clan, relationship. Some of us belong to medicine societies and will indicate that. Those are relationships. Traditional territory, treaty, relationships. Some of us will share our spirit names, and that's also a relationship. Or just the statement that I'm an Anishinabe, that's also a relationship with the Creator. So very simply then, I quite literally am my relationships. I'm not an autonomous individual who pre-exists them. I'm not an autonomous individual constituted by them. I'm not an autonomous individual at all. I am my relationships. I'm interdependent all the way down. And I do really mean all the way. Last time, Elder Bone and Elder Painter spoke about Agowiidiwinan. And it's in a narrow sense, that means 7th generation, being the same word for great-grandparents and great-grandchildren. But in its deeper sense, as they explained, it means the link through our ancestors all the way through the beginning of time. Now here's why all of this matters, to know that I am my relationships. This part gets just a little bit technical. What defines each relationship is the set of baseline responsibilities that it includes. So being a father imposes certain responsibilities on me towards my sons and also towards my wife. Being a brother imposes certain responsibilities on me towards my brother. Being from Couchiching imposes certain responsibilities on me towards my community members. Each layer of my identity, and again, think about that introductory protocol, then contributes to setting out what I might reasonably expect of others and they of me. Now note that what my son expects of me is very different indeed from what I expect of him. He expects me to care for him and to ensure his well-being. I just expect him to listen most of the time, learn, and to grow. And if he's grateful now and then for something other than octonauts, that's great. I use the father-son example because it makes it easy to understand what I mean when I say that each kind of relationship sets out baseline responsibilities. But what the example shows holds true for every kind of relationship in a kinship system. This is a much bigger statement than it might at first appear, because kinship doesn't just mean blood kin. It's a kind of political category, which certainly includes blood kin, but which also includes many other beings who are analogized into kinship roles without being actual blood kin. And I'll say more about that in parts 3 and 4. Note the father-son example is also useful because it shows that expectation in a kinship system is uneven. Responsibilities vary significantly across different kinds of kinship roles. Again, his towards me, me towards him, very different. We might say that responsibility is kinship differentiated. So first, knowing who I am means knowing the many different ways in which I'm related to others in this world. And there are so many distinct kinship roles. But second, it means knowing the set of baseline responsibilities that each of those relationships carries. It's a lot to manage. A circle of Anishinaabe elders and I, including Elder Bone, Elder Painter, and Grandmother Kopanes, recently completed an Anishinaabe child welfare law. As part of that project, we generated the traditional words for dozens of kinship roles and the responsibilities that each carries. There's so much to know here. And there's much more still that could be said about kinship and Anishinaabe law, but for our purpose tonight, here's why all of this matters. If being a father to my son is part of my identity, then being a son to me is part of his. If relating to my family is part of my identity, then relating to me is part of theirs. This inherent relatedness serves as a powerful boundary on how I may interpret my teachings. First, it serves as a baseline context within which I take up the decision I'm being called to make in any given moment. So it's never just some person who's asking me to teach them, or who's being violent, or who wishes to harvest wild sage. It's always some kind of relative, even if our connection is as thin as the fact that we both live in the same earth community. As we've just seen, our relatedness means that there are always baseline responsibilities that inform how I approach decision making. And those baseline responsibilities constrain how I interpret my teachings. Maybe my relationship with the person soliciting my help to harvest wild sage gives me a teaching responsibility to them. If so, that will inform how I reason through my teachings in coming to a decision about whether and how to help them. Second, because we are our relationships, and those relationships in a kinship system are always reciprocal, my actions reflect on others. Because who I am is part of who my family is and who my community is, my actions reflect on them. And my knowledge of this fact is a very powerful motivator for me to reason with integrity. In a moment of decision making, I use my teachings, if I use my teachings for my own interests, my family, my community, all the layers of my relational identity reflected in my introduction might also bear the cost of that decision. And where I need them, and much more importantly, where my relationship with them is part of my understanding of who I am, I have overwhelming reasons to act honorably. This is just one small part of how an Anishinaabe system of law isn't a system where anything goes. There are controls in place which promote systemic integrity and reliability within Anishinaabe law. Kinship is just one part, but it's among the biggest parts of that integrity. Now, that brings me to the third part of our discussion tonight about sacred and natural law. For some of you, it might be exciting to better understand the power of kinship. We often talk about folks we aren't necessarily really related to by blood as aunties and grandmothers, for instance. And it was exciting for me to learn where that language comes from. But some of you may feel that a kinship system of law raises many issues and is perhaps not for you. We're quite far from the known world of Canadian law here. Well, it certainly does raise many issues, none of which I'm able to address tonight. And for most of us, given the influences in our lives over the last 150 years, suspicion about kinship seems pretty reasonable to me. I have no illusions that a single lecture on this topic will persuade folks to center it in their own lives, as much as I wish that could happen. I will say, though, that even if unknowingly, many of us are already living it, even as we live under Canadian law. And again, how often have we heard about aunties or grandmothers in our community that we aren't related to? And I also hope that in our own lives, we bring scrutiny to bear on kinship's alternatives, because being more familiar doesn't necessarily mean that they should be less scary to us. Now, I thought that given how likely the sorts of worries about kinship are to be, it might be helpful to consider where it comes from. And this will be an exceptionally brief account because to really do it justice, it would have to be its own lecture. So here goes the very brief version. As I was taught to me, in the beginning, there was Kijemenido, the creator. He had a vision of creation. He brought that vision into being, creating first the physical earth of mountains and valleys and plains and caves, and next the plant order of trees and flowers and foods and medicines, and then the animal order, the four-leggeds, the flyers, the crawlers, and last, the swimmers, and last, he created humans. But he didn't just create each order of being. First, he created them with unique gifts. And we say, Agowiidiwinan, those special gifts from spirit. And in what we often call original instructions, he asked each order of being to share its gifts with the others so that all would have their needs met and all would flourish together because of one another. And second, he created each order of being related to one another to help organize how they would live out their original instructions of sharing the gifts that they carry. So that's to say, there's an order inherent in creation. I certainly don't presume to know how non-humans relate to each other. But from our standpoint, as Anishinabe, we call the sun grandfather, the moon grandmother, animals our elder brothers. I was once taught even that a tree is Anishinabe, that is, a tree person with whom to have a relationship and not a resource to be used. So baked right into sacred and natural law are the basic principles we've been discussing: inherent relatedness, the responsibility to share with and help others, and the union of those two ideas, kinship, as the basic framework for organizing baseline responsibilities. So Anishinaabe haven't decided that kinship is the best way to organize human communities. That's not where it comes from. We understood that it's creation's own way. Our decision then was to follow creation's lead and let it be our way too, as best as we can understand it. So instead of standing apart from creation, we are immanently part of it. And that commitment is reflected in the foundations of our legal system. It's a system which is far from perfect. I've never heard an elder say, we're better than anybody else. And indeed, as with all legal systems, it has important frailties. But it also has the distinct advantage of not only respecting the earth, but of making us part of it. Under our law, we are the earth. Again, I am my relationships. So under Anishinaabe law, something like anthropocentric climate change wouldn't be possible. That's a big thought. So there's the very short version of how Anishinaabe law is grounded in sacred and natural law, and so works with and even as Earth. And again, I don't imagine that this third part of my talk will solicit a stampede towards kinship in people's lives, but I do hope that in sketching out how kinship works, where it comes from, and most important, how it serves as part of the foundation for Agowiidiwinan, the first part, Anishinaabe law, you feel that you have something worth reflecting on and at least the possibility of a choice. And it's an invitation that I want to extend to all peoples. I'm talking about Anishinaabe law, but I invite everyone listening to think about what this would mean for them and for their own communities, right? So not cultural appropriation, not to take Anishinaabe stories, but to think of your own stories, right? Your own way of understanding the earth, what this might look like for you. So that brings me to the fourth and final part of my talk this evening, treaty from an Anishinaabe law standpoint. And I'm hoping that with the first three parts, we now have sufficient resources in place for what that means to be obvious. Let's start with the word for treaty. As Elder Bone teaches, in Anishinaabe, treaty is Agowiidiwinan, which refers to relationship. Treaty is not then a moment in time. It isn't something we took or signed. It isn't about an agreement made long ago, still binding today. It isn't set terms outlining what each party agreed to give the other. It simply isn't a special kind of contract. Treaty is a relationship, and like all relationships, it changes through time. Treaty relationships contemplate this change. That's why they include annual processes of renewal, where we gather in ceremony and to feast. The relationship is what allows for exchange. And what gets exchanged was always meant to change, depending on the relative gifts and needs of the parties. How do we know what those gifts and needs are? It's a big question. Well, the answer I want to suggest, predictably I hope, is kinship. As relationships, treaties don't occur between contracting partners, but rather between relatives. And there are certainly exceptions, but as a general trend, treaties between Indigenous nations were lived out as relationships between brothers. They contemplated roughly equal exchange with a high degree of latitude for shifting movements of give and take over years and changing fortunes. And where imbalances existed, we might make subtle changes, such as calling each other elder or younger brother. Treaties between Indigenous nations and European ones more typically took the form of parent-child relationships. So we would refer to the king or queen as our father or mother, which is also how, say, queen, her representatives on the ground described her to us. And she's typically referred to us as her children. Now, the primary source material is just full of evidence of these facts, including here in Manitoba. And it would be very difficult, I think, to argue against them. And there's also terrific secondary literature pulling those sources together. I know here in Manitoba, one which many of you will be familiar with is M.A. Craft's book on Treaty 1, and she's got a whole chapter on this specific issue. A big question is this offensive? Is it belittling to us to think of the Crown as a parent? Certainly it is from the standpoint of Canadian law and culture. It would suggest that we're not yet fully formed beings, incapable of the judgment necessary to govern ourselves appropriately, rightfully, wards. But are these the meanings associated with parent-child relationships from an Anishinaabe standpoint? I've often been taught how important it is to learn from children. I've been taught to treat my own children with a very high degree of deference. Well, I'm hoping we now have the resources in place to see that from an Anishinaabe perspective, identifying us with the role of a child isn't offensive. It doesn't place us in a position of diminished authority. Within our kinship system, parent-child distinctions aren't about power distributions, but rather about the relative distribution of responsibilities. In particular, as children, we can reasonably expect our parent to meet our needs because that's its responsibility. And expect reciprocally, it can expect our loyalty and support. In practical terms, this means that the European crown of the day was always expected to give more than it received. So I hope we can appreciate why last time Elder Bone and Elder Painter would have shared that from our Anishinaabe perspective, treaty was supposed to be on top of what we already had. So I have written this lecture not to be overly academic, because I'm hoping that folks will engage it afterwards at their kitchen tables. But I couldn't resist bringing in just a couple of quotations on this point, because they're it's such an important point for our community members. And so as some of you will know, at Anishinabe, we were initially allied with the French And after the fall of New France, that changed. At the Treaty of Niagara in the summer of 1764, Sir William Johnson, the highest ranking colonial authority in British North America, succeeded in bringing us into the relationship with Britain. We were then part of what was called the Western Confederacy. 3 months after entering into that treaty relationship, Johnson wrote to General Gage saying, quote, "You may be assured that none of the Six Nations, Western Indians, etc., ever declared themselves to be subjects, or will ever consider themselves in that light, whilst they have any men or any open country to retire to. The very idea of subjection will fill them with horror." A few lines later, he directly addressed the fact that different kinship understandings, Western and Indigenous, were at issue. Quote, "It's necessary to observe that no nation of Indians have any word which can express or convey the idea of subjection. They often say, 'We acknowledge the great king to be our father, we hold him fast by the hand, and we shall do what he desires.' Many such like words, of course, for which our people too readily adopt and insert a word very different in signification and never intended by the Indians, without explaining to them what is meant by subjection." The next day, this is my last quote, he wrote to the Lords of Trade, decrying a treaty supposedly signed at Detroit when he wasn't present, in which Colonel Bradstreet alleged that Wendat and Anishinaabe made, quote, expressions of subjection, contrasting this supposed understanding with the one achieved at the Treaty of Niagara. Johnson said, "I am well convinced they never mean or intend anything like it, and that they cannot be brought under our laws for some centuries. Neither have they any word which can convey the most distant idea of subjection, and should it be fully explained to them, and the nature of subordination, punishment, etc. defined, it might produce infinite harm." There we have direct statements from Britain's highest ranking colonial official, excuse me, understanding the difference in how we read kinship rules. So that ends my talk. I want to say thank you for listening. And now I hope to learn from you. And I really want to insist, there are no silly questions. Miigwech, 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 mia.
Thank you, Aaron. That was a wonderful presentation, and I think we will take a look at our chat to see if there are any questions that have come through. I'll just have a second to pull it up, and failing that, I have some questions, and perhaps that will trigger some questions from our audience, and we'll get started. So I encourage everyone, please, don't be shy, reach out. And as Aaron had mentioned earlier in his presentation, there are no silly questions. If you're thinking of them, chances are, 10 other people listening and watching tonight are having the same questions. But I'm going to start. I'm going to take advantage of this time and maybe start some of that conversation or discussion with you, Aaron. And I know what you talked about tonight was such a mind shift, I think, for many. And as you said, it's a very short time to talk about this, because this is a lifelong journey. It really is a journey, and so it's a little unfair perhaps of us to say, could you talk about this in this short period of time? So thank you for doing it in this time period. And I know for people out there, this is it's a snapshot of the entire piece, and there's no way that we would be able to, as you said, persuade people to live kinship, but I think what we hope to do is at least help people understand what we mean by Indigenous law or Anishinaabe law, that it, first of all, it exists. And it's not something that was given up, surrendered, extinguished, any of those things. It's very much alive today. And we each have to seek that out. But I'm going to ask you a question, maybe to get things going, as I did with the elders last time. And you heard them talk about spirit and intent of treaty, and talk similarly in terms of our responsibilities, that there's responsibilities in this relationship. So from an Anishinaabe law perspective, let's look at the phrase, we are all treaty people. And maybe if you could elaborate a little bit on what that is, or what that means perhaps to you as, you know, from that Anishinaabe law perspective. What does that mean, we are all treaty people?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess what I would want to say is it means that we welcomed settler peoples in as relatives. And I think our perspective is that's how we hope they would behave.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a relationship where we connected to them. Some of the literature, there are historical records, Queen talks about her red and white children. And so that would suggest individual people, communities, we were supposed to connect as siblings. And that means we're supposed to share with each other. We're supposed to make each other stronger. We're supposed to really care about how one another is doing, because we understand that when the other partner is doing well, we're stronger too.
Mm-hmm.
And so unlike the contract idea, it isn't us against them, it's all of us together. And so the more that we can help one another, the stronger all of us become. So I think that was the idea that our ancestors had coming into treaty. And my hope with a lecture like this is that we have just some of the pieces to start thinking about to help to communicate a shift towards something like that again.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to another question, and something that I picked up in your talk in terms of the language that was used by even representatives of the Crown. The Treaty Commissioner, for example, used that when he was talking about, you know, negotiations of the land and sharing of the land. He used the kinship references, you know, to brothers, brotherhood and treating like brothers, and that was there. And I always, you know, I understood that part, and I'll share a little bit about terms of my own learning, I guess, about kinship and the significance of kinship. Is I heard and this is a number of years ago, and I'm going to make reference to Dennis Whitebird, and I can't recall if it was when he was treaty commissioner or when he was grand chief or when he was chief, but at some event I heard him talking, and again, about the significance of treaties, and he made reference to us as First Nations people, the Queen's red children. And you know, in all honesty, I was a little bit offended by that, and I thought, Dennis, like, what are you, you know, what are you thinking, what are you saying, not having this knowledge myself, and also learning about this. But maybe explain, if you could, you know, maybe elaborate a little bit more on that, on why we shouldn't be offended as First Nation people, and what that really means.
Yeah, well, it's a terrific question, and I think it's understandable that so many of our own community members feel that way. I'm confronted with that fairly often. And I think it comes quite naturally after 150 years in many cases, sometimes more, of thinking about treaties in a different sort of way. And it's a way which diminishes our sovereignty
Mhm.
right? The perspective from Canadian law is that treaties are something that the Canadian Constitution can recognize and affirm. And I think many of the folks grounded in our own traditional system of law would instead say treaty is the relationship that allows there to be a Canadian Constitution.
Mhm.
Right? They've got the poles reversed.
Yeah.
And so when we think, and this is what's so challenging, when we become disconnected, as I think most of us have in different degrees, certainly myself, we lose that original, the system of thought. It's not ideas, right? Our ideas were never timeless. Like, we're not fundamentalists, but the system of thought has been badly fractured, and many of us can't access it. Elder Bone often makes the point, the extraordinary value of our own language, because it has those thinking processes built right into it, right? So I have to say it's a worry I'm sympathetic to, but of course, it's not one I share.
Exactly.
And I, as gently as I can, as often as I can, want to encourage people to question why it is they think that a parent-child relationship needs to signal a lack of our sovereignty, and to open up other ways of understanding what that might mean. Maybe it doesn't have to be scary. In fact, maybe it can be part of our resources to undo the way things are. I mean, I think right now it's pretty scary. I think it is terrifying, the kind of relationship that we're living within. So,
well, at the time I was, of course, a lawyer by trade. I don't practice anymore, but at that time I was a young lawyer thinking I knew, a lot. And my concern was that the Canadian system was going to see that as First Nations people accepting this ward relationship.
Yeah.
And that was like, why are you can't say that. Don't be saying that, because it's going to be viewed as, well, you're accepting this wardship, but that's a completely different, that's the relationship, the Indian Act, the fiduciary relationship. We think about this ward parent relationship in that sense, and not the kinship, the relational aspect of it from Anishinaabe law.
Yeah. So you've raised a hugely important point. I think if we think about engaging with Canadian law, I need to acknowledge there is real risk. There probably is with what I'm advocating for, because Canadian law has a whole set of power relationships that go with it, and it's very hard for our people to be heard what we're really saying, right? It gets translated, even when we speak in English, right? The points of reference, the baseline understandings, the philosophy underneath when an elder is on the giving testimony, it gets read through the gloss of Canadian culture.
Yeah.
And so that makes it very, very hard for us to have the meanings that we would want attached to the words we use be the ones that actually carry the day. But to that worry, I would want to say, I don't think it's insurmountable. I think knowing it and naming it means we have to be very, very careful and particular, right, in addressing that problem before a court. But the other piece I would want to add is what I've been advocating for tonight, this not new, this very ancient vision of treaty informed by Anishinaabe law, that I think we have every reason to think is just as relevant today as it ever was, isn't about state actors or Canadian permissions. It's actually something we don't look to our elected officials for. It's something we pick up that responsibility ourselves. We, as individuals, at the family level, at the individual level, we would be the ones to make that change. It's not something, we would vote on. We're not looking for permission to live out kinship. We just do it, right? It's on each of us. We have that power.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, it kind of goes back to, again, what the elders were talking about. Agowiidiwinan, like it's already there,
That's it.
right? And so it's living it, as you say. It's acknowledging and understanding that it's there, understanding how it relates to Canadian law. Be mindful of it, and then. But I think what we want to do here as well is to understand to Canadian law that Anishinaabe law is there, and this is what it is, and so that has to have that understanding, right? I don't know how we move forward if we don't have the understanding that it's there, and what that is. Even if we don't understand it completely,
Yeah.
You have to understand that it exists, and it still exists. It's not something that was extinguished through the treaties. It in fact, it survives it, right? It survives those relationships, and it carries forward, carries on.
I think all of that is just so important. And I think there's also not just wisdom and value, but I think it's absolutely essential that we do the kind of things that you were talking about, you know, engaging in Canadian law with their doctrines. So I don't mean to be talking down on those kinds of activities. I want to center our own way of thinking, our own understandings of treaty, of law. But I also think that as long as that's our center, we make space in our communities when we engage strategically with Canadian law, right? I think that is important, and I'm grateful for folks who get that training and do that work like yourself, right? Learning as a lawyer about Section 35 and Indian Act and all that kind of stuff. We really, like, that's essential stuff.
Yeah.
So I hope that I don't come across as talking down on that, because that's just so important. I just don't want it to be the center.
Exactly. You're not starting from that point and coming over. It's, you know, it really is a side by side, and examining and understanding our respective laws in that sense. And so, you know, Indigenous law is a word or words that are being heard more and more. Recently, it certainly wasn't something when in my law school days that people even talked about. When we talked about, you know, in my time, it was Aboriginal law.
Yep.
And really in law school, it was Canadian law as it applies to Aboriginal peoples.
Yep.
But that's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about that at all. We're talking about...
Exciting.
Pardon?
Isn't that exciting?
It's exciting. I get to see it, you know, but yeah, we're not talking about that at all. So again, you know, it's this mind shift. It's kind of setting aside perhaps what we have been trained in. You don't have to be a lawyer to have this thinking, right? You have to, but set aside this Canadian, that's only Canadian law, but, you know, understanding and respecting that there is Indigenous law. And as we said, you may not get it right away, but I think that's part of the relationship, right? Between, through the treaty relationship.
And I want to get my elbows out a little bit and say, we've been expected for so long to engage with Canada on its own terms, on its understandings, and to make the best arguments we can within that space. And what I want to say is this push that I'm trying to be part of about just what you're saying, understanding our own ways. There's another system of law, Indigenous law. It isn't just for us. I think that other folks should have to learn it as well and engage us on our terms.
Yeah.
Right? That would be more equality of that. So it's not just about making space for us to do this. I think we should have a legitimate expectation of our treaty partner that it does the hard work of learning it and being able to speak to us on our terms as well.
Yeah. And if you think of it, if you look back at the history of when the treaties were made, the treaty commissioner engaged First Nation law, you know, and we see that again. You referred to Aimé's book, where she describes the protocols that were used, right? So it's been done, but once the treaties were entered, it was kind of dropped, right? But I think you know, we're saying let's get back to that original relationship. I do have some comments maybe coming through the chat, and I'd like to share some of that. Denise is thanking you. I really learned a lot, and this is a great way of living. I wish non-Indigenous societies had this way of understanding.
They do. Pick it up.
Yeah. Very interesting way to view law. It makes it very organic. Could Aaron recommend any writings, his own or by others, that explain these concepts of kinship and law, and also include historical information such as the comments made by the British colonial officer for further learning?
Right. So maybe I would think of two different sets of resources. So on that kinship piece, there's a Mays book. There's a paper, I think it's called Gifts as Treaties. I forget exactly what it's called, by Carrie Miller, who I understand is actually professor in Winnipeg now. Wasn't when I read the paper, but I thought it was quite impressive, and it addresses this issue. And there's a wonderful paper by a scholar named Mark Walters. He's Dean of Queen's Law, called Your Sovereign and Our Father. So right in the title, coming right to the different meanings. So there's just three pieces, and we should name a Mays book. About the Stone Fort Treaty, Anishinaabe perspective of Treaty 1, breathing life into the Stone Fort Treaty. So there's the three works that sort of jump right to mind. For the historical, like the archival material, it's literally everywhere. Like you almost can't find a document that's directly on this point, which doesn't have that language. The documents are just shot through with it. The Sir William Johnson papers, the colonial documents of New York. But in terms of pieces that help us to think through this whole other way of imagining law, Anishinaabe, not using the language of kinship, but I think maybe modeling it in the piece. One of my favorite pieces is from a fairly junior Coast Salish legal scholar. His name's Robert Clifford, and it's called Listening to Law. And so that's a piece, I think it's widely available, but I love Robert because he's younger than me, but I feel like he's wiser. It's like talking to someone who's like much older than me. And
that's like you to me.
You're far too kind. And it's a bit like sitting with an elder. I mean, I don't want to overdo it, but he just speaks from this space. You know what I think it mostly is? He's not telling us, he's modeling, he's showing it. And so the key teaching of the piece is actually listening very carefully to how he's speaking to you, more than even what he's saying, although the content is important as well. But that's one of my favorite pieces. And because it doesn't tell, it models what it actually looks like to live out law in this other sense of teachings shaped by our relationships, limited and bounded by our relationships.
It's just doing it.
Yeah.
Right?
That's right.
It's just doing it, not waiting for that approval or permission before you do it.
Yeah.
Before you live it. Yeah.
I mean, other than that, mostly what I read is like, I read a lot where elders have allowed their orations to be transcribed. I read a lot of primary source material where, watching YouTube videos where folks are sharing. Well, this will sound like a plant, and I say to our audience, it truly isn't. But honestly, the treaty relations, the treaty elders, the 4 volumes were hugely, like it'd be hard to imagine my dissertation without them, actually. There's just so much in there. I think I would want to direct folks to that. And I've said that publicly in many spaces before sitting here with you tonight. So.
Well, thank you, and I couldn't agree with you more that the voices of those elders, many of whom have gone on, were that knowledge was gifted to the commission on the understanding that it would be so people could hear it.
Yeah.
People could come and they could read it and understand and get a glimpse of what that knowledge is. And you talked about in your presentation the reluctance for a long time for elders to have that knowledge committed to writing, but I think they've understanding the urgency almost to be able to share that knowledge, and that's one way that they've been agreeing to share knowledge is through the written form. Okay.
And increasingly being video recorded as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sort of amazed at how much elders are getting into that.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful, including our elders here at the Treaty Relations Commission, and we're so grateful. I'm going to read a little bit more here. Trish says, Trish here. Hi, Trish.
Yeah.
The idea of kinship on which laws are based makes more sense to me than the adversarial type of law we European settler types have. It seems to me that there is a better chance of understanding the idea of the common good, which white society has difficulty accepting. It seems to me that kinship puts less stress on individualism, which I very much appreciate. Can you suggest any bibliography that could further my understanding on this concept? I think you've done that and you've offered that. So Trish, hopefully you've captured some of the recommendations. Carmen says, this is very enlightening. Thank you for this presentation. Many clues to understanding are there in this presentation. Thank you, Erin Mills. Miigwech, this was so powerful. Thank you. I agree. As I learn more about the way treaties have been twisted and misused, and the written treaties are not what was agreed to by, I think, Indigenous ancestors, I feel like the existing treaties need to be ripped up and redone today with transparency and integrity. What are your thoughts on how to move forward in present day to honor what was actually intended in relationship and action by the ancestors?
Well, that for me, that's perhaps a much bigger question than the person asking it intends. I try to bring about change, transformative change, by modeling, by being it. And so, again, while I support strategic engagements in Canadian law, or ways to make a difference, engaging systems of power, I try to just actually show another way. And that's what I want to, that's how my grandma did it. I mean, she didn't identify as an activist, but I think she was far more radical than just about any activist I've ever met, right? Because even under the weight, in a bad mood moment, I would say the boot of ongoing Canadian colonialism, she just did her thing, right? And like, she passed recently. The impact on so many people's lives, what was shared about her from a life spent being like that, you couldn't calculate the kind of impact. And so, yeah, so, I mean, that's sort of the general approach I take.
And I think a question or a similar question was posed to Elder Bone last week in terms of, why don't we renegotiate the treaties? And Elder Bone's response, I believe, was no. Like these were done in the presence of Creator, and there was, First Nations brought themselves and all their Anishinaabe law to these. Why would they rip them up? I think it forces us to go back, as you said, to that original relationship. And I think if we focus just on the written texts of those agreements, we tend to feel that way. But for so long, the First Nation perspective, the Indigenous law that was involved in making treaties wasn't understood. And that brings it for myself, a whole new dynamic to understanding that treaty relationship. And I think that's what we want to leave with the audience, that we can't just focus on the written text, because that gives it value and it devalues the Indigenous law aspect to it. We have to get back to that, the Indigenous or Anishinaabe law part of the relationship.
Part of why I'm here tonight is I want to be part of that education. I'm sometimes misread as being a real hardliner, and I get why. I mean, I can feel that. But I mean, I am so deeply committed to bringing people in, to inviting questions, difficult questions. People are often scared to ask. They don't want to make a misstep, right? They don't want to be offensive somehow. They don't want to, but we need non-Indigenous folks to understand our ways. That's something my grandmother impressed very strongly on me, and I really carry that. And so I'm hopeful that there are all different kinds of Crown actors listening tonight. I love speaking with them, right? As much as I've shared a little about feelings I have about the current relationship, I hope that they would feel, invited in, comfortable to reach out. And what I, would encourage, instead of rewriting the treaties, start those who have responsibilities to carry out treaty power, if I could put it that way, through various Crown offices, their side of treaty power, act like a relative. Act like a relative. We can think of, I'm mindful, my elder Harry Bone is in the building here tonight, and to really keep it positive, but without even mentioning, we would all think of, a number, and I think two probably come right to mind for many people in this country, a very hot button issues right now, where the Crown could just stop and take a radically different perspective. And if it understood itself still, it has forgotten. If it understood that it is a relative of Indigenous peoples today, the current course of action could not be justified and sustained. I'm thinking, I just have to say, and I'm thinking most importantly of our kids.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of our dear friend Elder Bone, and I've been in many training sessions with him where he shared the perspective that he shared as well last week, and he always says, we're not here to convert anybody. It's not about converting and accepting, and everybody has to live Indigenous or Anishinaabe law, but you have to understand it and you have to respect it, and then we can move forward. So very much exactly what you've just shared as well.
He's my teacher.
I'm going to go over here to Robin. Good evening. Thank you for your sharing. I would like to acknowledge my gratitude for you speaking my language to deepen my understanding. I was heartened to hear an example of a settler leader who understood some Indigenous perspectives and tried to convey this to their superiors. Could you share other such settler or Crown representatives who understood Indigenous perspectives? This is the first time I hear of one whose understanding was demonstrated.
That's tough, because many of the folks I would want to mention are folks living and active today. And while I would be only too keen to single them out as living examples of this, I don't think they're folks who would be happy for me doing so. They're quite happy working a little more behind the scenes, speaking with their own people, supporting Indigenous folks, and I don't think they would want the kind of attention that mentioning their names in this moment would bring to them. But maybe I can just sort of, say, yeah, those folks are there.
They are there.
And I'm in dialogue with some of them. Some of them are, well, I can say just how seriously I take the point that what I'm talking about is for everyone. There's at least one a non-Indigenous person who I think of as an elder, because this guy, he's got all the practices. It's a lot like sitting with my grandmother. He's so careful. He's on Agowiidiwinan. He would use a different word for it, not that way of gentleness, but and I learn a lot, from him. And that's one. Virtually every other elder that I sit with is Indigenous, and almost in every case Anishinabe. So I don't want to make the point larger than it should be either, but there is one for me. So
yeah. So and the point is, they are out there, and so that gives us hope, right? It helps in that understanding. This is from Victoria. Thank you for this incredible talk. I was transfixed from start to finish. One thought that occurs to me regarding respecting a child's right to self-determination is that children do grow up and still have their parents and are still their parents' children when they are grown up, although the relationship may change a little bit as parents grow old and maybe require support themselves. So I don't know if there's a question in there, but I think it's a comment on that.
Maybe a gentle challenge, but a good one.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Michelle says, thank you so much for offering your perspective as both a person of colonial settler heritage and a student of law. I am very appreciative of the opportunity to learn about Indigenous law, and I hope to have more chances to learn in the future. I believe that our Western system of justice would be greatly improved by incorporating principles of Indigenous law. Do you see the possibility of expanding the teaching of Indigenous law in JD programs like the one at the University of Victoria to the rest of Canadian law schools?
Working hard at it at McGill. Yeah, I mean, and many of my colleagues are, right? There's a lot of Indigenous scholars at law schools today, senior and junior, who are doing their best. And, we have, I think, senior scholars in the field to thank for making that space. And so, John Boros was my co-supervisor and someone I care very deeply about. And he's probably worked most tirelessly to try and create space. And so now others of us are maybe using that space in slightly different ways than he has. And I'm sure I'm one of those folks, but it's because of their work that there is that space. And so those dialogues are happening, I think, at a great many law schools in Canada, not so much outside of Canada, a little bit, but not a lot. And in some places, much more than others. But I think just today and yesterday, emails came across my inbox looking to hire Indigenous law professors at 2 different law schools in Canada. And so I guess I want to say these efforts were underway long before the TRC's specific calls to action about this. But those calls have just created so much more space. So any institution that needed a little bit of additional rationale for pushing in this direction now has it and can use it. And so that's really helped facilitate, it's really given a big push, I think, to what's happening at Canadian law schools. Also, lots of resistance, right? There's and I take it that point is probably pretty obvious. It's not something that's just sort of, moving in and planting roots. It's lots of big discussions, sometimes disagreements, not easy, but I think it's happening. And so, we're starting to see some field courses as one thing that, I have particular hope for, because getting out of the classroom, if you ask any elder, right, is so important to actually be in community or to be on the land to really be learning. And increasingly, I think some law schools in Canada are actually starting to make space and resources for that So
Mhm.
that's a good sign.
And you know, it brings the question of, I guess some thoughts perhaps is our law schools a place for Indigenous law, right? I mean, you're bringing it into
Mhm.
a very narrow part of Anishinaabe law,
Yeah.
Indigenous law. So I think it's a good maybe starting point to get the Canadian legal system or the Canadian system thinking about it. But I you know, I don't see it ending up there.
I'm
Right?
so glad you raised this. It hadn't occurred to me, and like what an important part of this conversation. So, and you know, different elders I sat with have very different and strong views about that.
Mhm.
And it's definitely something that people can, you know, reasonable minds can disagree about. For me, I'm very, very express and transparent with my students that what I'm able to create for them in our class. And it depends on the class, but most of my courses I teach in circle, the way my grandmother taught me, is just the beginning of a beginning. It's just, there's only this small amount that I can bring into the space that we can do here. But for many of them, that small amount is absolutely enormous.
Yes.
And like more than that would be overwhelming anyways.
Mhm.
And so I'm just very, very clear that what I can do on my own without, you know, my own elders. And so I always bring in Harry and Sherry for at least one class in each of my courses. It was better before COVID when they could come in person, so the students can experience that connection. But so there's small things like that, but yeah, it's very different. And I'm also very clear that even the circle, I've modified it in a really key way. And so I invite the students to bring in more than just their analytical minds, but that normally a circle is not constrained by readings or videos or elders orations that have been transcribed, or people just bring what they bring. And so ours is a bit artificial in that sense, and that we've got some sort of starting points. So those are, you know, some of the ways that I try and manage that difficulty, but it's a real one. And I think it would be a huge mistake for an Indigenous professor teaching Indigenous law not to be aware of that and not to be transparent about the limits that they face.
Yeah, I think that's very important to have that conversation, and as you say, to be open about it, because the danger, as you know, I mentioned, is to narrow it and to minimize it and compare it to Canadian law, and that's not it at all.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
I mean, you can do a small piece, but really we need to get the students out onto the land and into community, and that's where the real action is.
Exactly. So I'm going to move on to Mariah, sorry. Miigwech for the insightful presentation. It seems much of the discourse on reconciliation relates to matters in the hands of government leaders and officials. I believe all the 94 calls of action are to government or other institutions. Your lecture on kinship brought the discourse to a much more personal level. Building on this, what are some ways non-Indigenous people at the personal level can build kinship with Indigenous peoples?
Wow, I'm absolutely delighted to be asked this question. So I'm very grateful to this person, you say Mariah, for asking it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is either a very short, sort of 1 or 2 sentence kind of conversation, or it just swallows up everything. Because there's so much to be said. But the really brief version, I think, would be.
I'm just going to say, don't give it all away, because our next session with you is actually going to start saying, what do we do, right? And move forward. So Mariah, he's just going to give
it's the soundbite.
Just the soundbite so that you come back.
Think of what it means to be a good relative. Yeah. Don't worry about being an ally or about, you know, amplifying our voices. Those are great things. I'm not saying don't do them. but
Mhm.
the real action is in how you conduct your life, all the moments when you're not in our presence. How are you living on this earth, right? How are you engaging with your own people that teaches them how they should engage with us?
Mhm.
That's the heart of it for me. I'll stop there.
We'll stop there. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you very much. Charlton says, thank you for this broader understanding of Anishinaabe law. Dee says, sorry, I missed the name of the book and the author. Thank you. If you can put these in chat, thanks so much when you can, if you can. Okay, I'm not able to do that. I'm not that great, but we'll try and get those out. Molly says the book, oh, okay, Molly's responding.
Great.
The book is by A.M.A. Crafton called Breathing Life into the Stone Fort Treaty, an Anishinaabe Understanding of Treaty 1. And if there are other ones, let us know if that's not the one that you're thinking of. And then people are looking for, they're naming the different books. So they're going ahead and responding.
See, helping each other.
Yeah,
Right, it's working
exactly.
already.
Be good relatives right there.
There you have it.
Trish says, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to learn more about Indigenous ways of life. Learned so much. I'm grateful to be part of this discussion. And then others are asking about the recording. And
Right.
Again, it's on the Treaty Relations Commission website or YouTube channel. I'm sorry. So this kind of brings us to the end of the evening. We could sit here all night and
Yeah,
talk,
having
but we
fun.
want to invite our audience to come back at the end of the month on the 24th, I believe it is, of November, where we can talk about how we go forward. And just briefly to end off, if there are last comments you want to give before we close tonight's session.
I'll just end the way I was taught, in gratitude. It's I'm so grateful for this opportunity to share this little bit that I've been given to carry, but also to everyone who showed up. This is late for many folks, and I know many folks have kids, and being here tonight meant you weren't somewhere else, probably where someone needed you, and it came at some cost. It's a great start for what you and I have been talking about having to pick up the responsibility yourself. I mean, it can begin by just showing up.
Right.
So I'm, grateful for that, and just hope, want to encourage that to continue.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you to everyone for joining us this evening for this great discussion and conversation, learning about the importance of treaties and kinship as it relates to treaties. We will see you back here next week for our third session with Professor Brenda Gunn on what UNDRIP means for the treaty relationship. So miigwech. Good night.
Miigwech.